Well, let's go ahead and begin. Welcome. My name is Ross Cochran, and I'm very happy to be with you tonight. I want us to get right into the Gospel of Luke for a few minutes and see how this goes. It's good of you to give up your Friday evening. Some of you students are taking this for credit, but a lot of you are here giving up visits with friends, or maybe you're here with friends, and maybe so. It's good to see you. A lot of reunions happening. You may have heard this, that the Gospel of Luke follows a particular structure that most people recognize. It, ironically, begins and ends in the temple. And that's ironic because, of course, Luke is a Gentile. And the temple, most notably thought of as the headquarters of the Jewish people. It's God's place, but they think it's theirs. And here's this Gentile author anchoring his portrait of Jesus in the temple. When you open up the first page, there's Zechariah in the temple, and then the disciples are waiting there praying when it ends. And along the way, you have this journey narrative. I was drawing this on the board recently for some of my students, and I noticed the resemblance between this diagram and my head. But what it is this, when you get to chapter 9:51, it says Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And periodically, along the narrative, it'll say, now, while he was on his way to Jerusalem, so you're always reminded that that's where you're going. And then it ends when he enters Jerusalem for the triumphal entry. Okay? I've been asked to speak on discipleship in a community of mission. And when you read the Gospel of Luke, the mission takes on a couple of forms. You have this journey. Jesus is resolute about getting to Jerusalem, knowing quite well what awaits him there. The other way that the form mission takes is this inclusive activity of Jesus. He's lifting up people that have been shunned or discarded, and that's a theme that is most often or frequently noted. The way community takes form here is this. In some ways, all the characters in the gospel form the community, and there's a little bit of an us-them, but the us-them is within the community for the most part. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. I wanted to just call your attention to four dynamics. These aren't maybe even the most prominent dynamics, but I wanted you to see something about them. You have some resistance going on in the Gospel of Luke, as you do the other Gospels. The resistance comes from the religious leaders who feel a bit threatened, a bit challenged about what Jesus is saying and doing. It's the nature of institutions. This isn't, I'm not saying this to be disrespectful to institutions. It's just the nature of institutions that they have to pretty soon get into self-preservation mode. For example, schools like Harding, that I dearly love, changed my life. We have two missions. We're not just trying to develop Christian servants. We're trying to keep the doors open so that we can develop Christian servants. And so you have to worry about PR, and you have to be concerned if people are shaking the boat too hard, and Jesus is shaking the boat. And so there's resistance there. And so you often read, for example, about the very first ministry moment in Luke chapter 4, 14 through 30, when he's in the synagogue in Nazareth. He tells these stories that sound like they're stories about Elijah and Elisha. But it turns out, Jesus said, well, there's much about Gentile folks, Naaman and the widow, as they are Elijah and Elisha. And they don't like that. It's really a tremendous change of tone in that story as the people love him. They can't say enough good about him. He's come home and announced that this messianic text from Isaiah is really about him. And they're all excited about that. And then he tells these stories and acknowledges that God has always had in his mission a place for Gentiles, and they're ready to kill him. Chapter 6 begins with the grain field story, and they're troubled that he's picking grain on the Sabbath. And the next story, he's in the synagogue and is about to heal a man with a shriveled hand, and they're not happy about that. And chapter 15, the context that sets up the parables of the lost things, the sheep and the coin and the sons, is set up by Jesus. All the tax collectors and sinners are gathering around to hear Jesus. And by the way, we have to ask, what do they see? What are they hearing that makes them come? But they're all gathering around Jesus, but the Pharisees and teachers of the law are objecting to this, which is a setup for the the story of the son. So you have this kind of resistance going on. That's one dynamic. Another dynamic is the opposite, a dynamic of receptivity. And you have people wanting to be around Jesus and very excited about his presence and also excited about what happens after he's present. He sees the centurion in that begins chapter 7. You've got to know how delighted the centurion was to have his son back. The very next story is the widow of Nain. You have to, and it says when Jesus touches the coffin and causes it to be still and raises the boy from the dead and gives him back to his mother, it said they all praised God loudly. And it's loud because they're happy. And it says that God has come to help his people. But when you look to see who his people are in that story, it's this nameless widow. And again, great joy. The lepers that are healed in chapter 17, and on and on and on you go. This people are drawn to Jesus, and something about his presence and message is life-giving. And that's a pretty consistent theme. There's another theme, distance. I should have put distance. I don't want to make too much of this, but there's about 4 or 5 stories in the Gospel of Luke that only appear in the Gospel of Luke, and distance is mentioned. It may be just Luke's style, his vocabulary. It could be that. But you have the gulf that exists in chapter 16 between the rich man and Lazarus. You have the young man, the young son in chapter 15 going away to a far country. In the parable of the 2 people praying in the temple in Luke 18, the Pharisee and the tax collector. The tax collector stands at a distance. And you have stories like that. And in the early church context, which I think Luke is trying to address, the problem is one of distance. It's tension between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, and Christ has called them to be one, but they're not used to that. They're not practiced in that. And they're not one, like Paul said in Ephesians, that God has brought those who are far away, he's brought them near. He spanned the distance, and distance is the problem. Distance is the problem that keeps us away from people relationally. But it could be just unfamiliarity, but also could be the assumptions we have about others. That creates distance, and I think Luke is addressing that, whether this vocabulary is intentional or not. And then the other dynamic I want you to see is the language of sight. The language of seeing, the language of vision. For example, when Jesus comes upon this woman, this widow, in early part of chapter 17, he says, when he saw the woman, this widow in the funeral procession, when he saw the woman, his heart went out to her. And when you read a statement like that, you're aware that vision here is not just images bouncing off the backs of our eyes and shining, bouncing around there with our retinas. It's a different kind of vision. It's an appreciative vision. It's an affirming vision. The statement, he saw her and his heart went out to her, are linked spiritually. They're linked. While a long way off, while the son's a long way off, the father spots him. He sees him. And compassion is present there for others. I want to focus your attention particularly on 2 stories. Luke 19 and Luke 7. Luke 19 is the story of Zacchaeus. The story says that they're passing through Jericho on their way to Jerusalem. Okay? Still headed to Jerusalem. I think this is a culminating story in Luke's gospel because after this he tells a parable and then he enters Jerusalem and it's the Passion Week. So in terms of the normal pre-Passion ministry moment, this is the story. And I think it culminates a lot of things. Zacchaeus, of course, we're told, is a wealthy tax collector, so he's practiced in this business of taking money from the Jews and giving it to the Romans. Ethnically Jewish, but functionally he's the enemy, which is why he's at the parade today alone. And he's up, I recognize this short story, but the shortness of the story, because when I was a sophomore in high school and was driving, okay, I was 5'2" and weighed 100 pounds. Okay? I got stopped by the police so many times I can't remember because they looked at me and said, that guy can't have a license. And they'd pull me over, and it was very embarrassing. Your friends, you see them at school, hey, Ross, you get caught for speeding, or something like that. But so I recognize the dilemma of this short stature. But he's up in the trees, and when Jesus comes along, he looks up. He looks. And this is one of the stories that I think, okay, what's going on in here in Jesus? That he got all these people around him. And he sees the individual. I remember you telling this story, Landon, once, and saying when Jesus said, Zacchaeus, I want to go home with you today, he said Zacchaeus burned bark all the way to the ground. He was just so excited to get to go with Jesus. And whatever they said that day changed him. Because he said, from now on, it's going to be different. And in response to that, Jesus says, this man is what? What does he call him? A son of Abraham. I guarantee you there was no one present that day that would have thought to assign that label to Zacchaeus. But Jesus said, I came to seek, which is a vision word. I came to see, to find, and to save that which was lost. And then you finally have this story. Luke chapter 7, it's got a lot of dynamics in it. It's a longer story. All four Gospels tell a story about a woman coming to anoint the feet of Jesus somehow. There's a few things about this one that's different. Jesus has been invited to the home of Simon the Pharisee, and they're having dinner there, and in comes this woman, and I just wonder about her. You know, all Luke tells us about her is that she had lived a sinful life, probably just being a gentleman when he says that, but here she is, and you have to wonder what she has heard about Jesus, what she has seen, that gives her this courage to bust into a place where she's not welcome. But she's so desperate to be with this one that she knows, she trusts somehow. So as she's tending to him, the text says that Simon sees this and he says to himself, what? If Jesus were really a prophet, really? He would know what kind of woman this is, and he would not let her be touching him like that. Well, Jesus senses that's what Simon's thinking, so he says, Simon, I got a story to tell you. What is it? Well, there were these two guys, and one owed so much money it would have taken a whole year's salary to pay it off, and the other one owed about 2 months' salary. And this creditor did this crazy thing. He decided to forgive them both, tore up the papers and said, let's just forget about it. I've often encouraged students to take that story to the business office and say, hey, Jesus said, no debt, hey, the loans are, Jesus says to Simon, which one loved him the most? Now, Simon's not an idiot, so he says, well, I guess the guy that had the bigger debt. And Jesus said, that's right. And then he says this, Simon, do you see this woman? Now, the text earlier said that he did. When he saw the woman, okay? But what you have going on in the larger ministry of Jesus, it's not just particular to Luke, but it's dominant in Luke, is that you have Jesus inviting us to look again at people and change our assumptions about them. I read recently in the news about Monica Lewinsky, and she's come forward again more publicly, and this time I think with more confidence than she had some years ago when she was being so heavily criticized. And what went on there, nobody questions that was wrong. But I'm just wondering, I'm trying to get it done, so I want to hear Landon's, what I'm trying to do. I just wonder, she's got access to the most powerful person, arguably, in the world. And am I so arrogant that I would think I am immune to losing my good judgment? If I had that kind of access, if I had that opportunity, and President Clinton was criticized a lot. Okay? But am I so arrogant to think that if I were in those halls, I probably had lots and lots and lots of opportunities. People putting opportunities in your way to try to buy influence. Am I so arrogant to think that I could consistently resist those temptations? What we do is we see people, we draw conclusions pretty quickly, and we disdain them. Okay? In Luke 18, it says the word, if you look for the word contempt or disdain, what's the story? It says, I'll think of it now in a minute. You've got the dynamic of people looking at others with contempt or looking down on them. Okay? The word I would use is disdain. It seems to me that we will never, ever influence anyone that perceives that we disdain them. Think about the people you listen to in your life. You listen to people, as I do, that you are absolutely certain care about you. They take you seriously. They listen to your stories. They know you're trash. And it doesn't change how they treat you. They advocate for you. They have interest in your future. And we've got some growing here to do, I think. I'm concerned about what I see going on in the culture wars. Okay? Do we really think that if we win all the public policy battles, that somehow Christianity is going to just take on new life? What if for Christianity to thrive, we had to withdraw from the culture wars? Okay? And instead work with individuals and look at them and treat them like our Lord Jesus did. We'll never have influence on the lives of those who perceive that we disdain them. A chief task for disciples in a community of mission is to learn to see others, to develop an extraordinary concern for the other, not just extraordinary in terms of it's a lot, but extraordinary in terms that it's rare. It's a level of concern, it's a level of grace that's so uncommon, it attracts. I want to close with a story, but I first want to introduce Landon, because I want to sit down right after I'll tell the story. Landon, I talk about you in all my classes every semester. Students don't know you, but they know your name. How many of you have heard Landon over the years? That's probably why you're here tonight, I think. Yeah. We owe you a lot, Landon. We owe you things about pointing us to the marketplace. We owe you for telling us to get outside the camp. We owe you so many insights about the Gospels and the church and looking out for those who are the farthest from the church, and we're indebted to you about that. I'm so glad you decided to come. Landon's a Harding alum, and recently, a few years ago, got an outstanding award. We're looking for ways we can to express our appreciation to you. I want to end by telling you my favorite story, and if you can see the connection between looking and concern, then it's done its job. Apparently there were these two Jewish brothers who were both farmers, and they lived across the road from each other on this old dirt road. One brother was married and had 9 children. And if we could just pause for a moment and appreciate what that house would be like. Okay? The other brother was single and lived alone. One night, the brother who's married was doing the dishes with his wife, and he said, "Honey, I'm concerned about my brother." And she said, "Well, what?" And she said, "Well, he's living alone over there, rattling around by himself in that big old farmhouse. I think I'd go nuts with all that silence, being alone. No wife for companionship, no children to bring him joy. I think I'd go insane." She goes, "I know what you mean. You know what you ought to do? You ought to pray and imagine, and those things often go together, what you might do to express concern for your brother." And so he did. He began to pray and to imagine what he might do. And one night it hit him as he was going to bed. He jumped up and said, "I'll be right back." "Where are you going?" "I'll tell you later." And he pulled on his coveralls and he got a lantern and went out to the barn, and he took a grain sack and he began scooping grain out of his grain bin, as much as he could carry, into the grain sack. And he tiptoed across the road in the darkness into his brother's barn and poured that grain into the grain bin of his brother. And he was so excited that he had found this tangible way to show his love for his brother that he could hardly go back to sleep. And every few nights he'd do this. He'd wait till the lights went out across the road. He'd get up and go to the barn and fill the grain sack and tiptoe across the road and pour that grain into the grain bin of his brother. And he just noticed that his own life took on a new richness, a new joy. Well, meanwhile, the brother who lived by himself got to thinking about his brother. And he was thinking to himself, "My word, how does he stand it? Those curtain climbing, ankle biting yard apes, I'd go nuts if I had to live in that house. And the responsibility of feeding 11 mouths, oh, Lord, how can I help my brother? And one night it hit him just before he went to bed. He got up, went to his barn, and got his grain sack and filled it full of grain and tiptoed across the road and poured that grain into the grain bin of his brother. And he was so excited that he had found this tangible way to show his love. Well, he kept doing that, and this went on for some time, each brother arising in the middle of the night and various times of the night, different nights, and tiptoeing across the road and filling each other's grain bin with their own grain. And they noticed as they gave, their own grain supply never diminished. And they remembered God's promise, if you give, you'll always have plenty. Well, one night it was inevitable. The moon was clear. The moon was full and the night was clear. And both brothers happened to arise on the same night at about the same time. They went to their respective barns and got their grain. And as they headed towards each other's barns, they saw each other at the edge of the road. The moonlight enabled that. And the story says that they all of a sudden they realized what had happened all these weeks. And that they were so overcome with their realization of love for each other that they dropped their grain sacks and ran and in joy embraced each other and wept. And this story goes on to say that God said, I want you to build my house, the temple, on that road where the brothers lived. And I want you to place its cornerstone on the spot where they embraced. Landon, we look forward to hearing from you.